Hey, how are you doing, everybody? Today, this week's instructional video, and I'm sorry I'm getting it in a little bit late. Rach and I had a book accepted, a collaborative book, and we had some deadlines to meet, and I got a little bit overwhelmed. So I apologize for that. You shouldn't come second, but it was a pretty extreme situation. But anyway, so this week we are focusing on a couple of things, and I'm going to try to pull them together a little bit to get you thinking about them. Um, the largest thing, the thing that the piece of creative writing studies theory that we're looking at, and by the way, that's what we're engaged in technically, is this area of what is now called creative writing studies, which is a brand new field, really. And what that really is a study of pedagogy or the study of the teaching of creative writing. And there's very little that's actually been done on that comparative to, say, composition theory or really any other pedagogies, largely because the model for doing it and the way that it arose kind of was enshrined very early in the 20th century and wasn't really challenged until the 60s. And that was the creative writing model where you have a dominant authoritative professor who's published a bunch of books telling students what creative writing what was and what made it good and what made it bad, and then conducting workshops in which everybody just completely shark-fested each other and lost all their confidence and gave up writing. I wish I could say that that was kind of a an exaggeration or hyperbole, but even as I was coming up through the discipline when I was in my 20s, which would be the mid 90s, I was experiencing that kind of workshop more often than not. Uh, and it was competitive and it was often hostile. So these movements towards transactional classrooms, mutuality in the classroom, and collaborative situations in the classroom are relatively new. One thing I would like to say, thinking about our current political climate, um, there was a professor that was just fired from the Texas A&M for teaching gender theory in a young adult reading classroom. And I'm not going to get into the politics of any of that, except to say that since it's on people's minds, um, you will notice that some of the readings that we have an ideology lurking behind them. Now, remember, these are people who are teachers of creative writing speaking to other teachers about their own perception of the way a creative writing classroom could work or a classroom could work. So a lot of these readings are not really intended for students because the whole idea of having a teaching of creative writing classroom is a relatively new thing. One thing I would like you to remember is that in a liberal arts institution, what we're trying to do is expose students to different kinds of ideas and worldviews. You shouldn't assume that all of them are the professors. For example, in the last class, when I was bringing up Paulo Freire, I kind of made the point that I'm not a communist, and I'm really not. And it's fine if you are, but it's also fine if you're a conservative Republican. My uh, teaching practices, I'm hoping, are open enough that someone from any background can do well in them. And when we talk about an inclusive and classroom that allows for transaction and allows for collaboration and allows for mutuality, even if those ideas seem to come from a very left-wing point of view, I hope that you can see how ideally they would create a space where people with any kinds of points of views and any kind of background would flourish. I would hope that I could create a classroom that Ernest Hemingway would do as well in as James Baldwin as Danez Smith. Um, so none of these ideas should be seen as exclusionary, and please don't assume that because I had you read something by Carolyn Forche or Catherine Standifer, that that's my point of view. And that's going to become an important reminder as we take a look at the anti-racist writing workshop, which its title seems like definitely presents a political and ideological point of view right from the get-go. Um, this isn't meant to be indoctrination. My job as a teacher is not to teach you what to think, but how to think, which is at the root of almost all of the creative writing theories that I'm presenting to you. So I hope you hear that. I hope you understand that that is a genuine point of view of mine, that I'm not trying to duck and cover. I certainly have my own political points of view. I'm not trying to make you agree or believe in them. Um, and I hope you hear that. So today, the big thing that we're going to be talking about is this idea of collaboration and collaborative writing in the classroom, collaborative learning in the creative writing classroom. As always, I'll share my very simple and with very large font lesson plan for today. Okay, so what is collaborative learning? Collaborative learning is a learning practice that seeks to decenter the traditional mentorship and lecture model regarding how writing skills are learned and developed. Um, this bases its practices on concepts from composition theory and theories of language acquisition. Big acquisition word there. So language acquisition. Um, how do we learn to speak in the world? How do we acquire language? Well, certainly some of that happens in the classroom, but if you think about it, most of it happens at home. It happens in the community. That we actually learn language through collaboration. I probably speak the way I do uh, because my father had degrees in English and counseling and divinity. So my speech patterns, my vocabulary, uh, is from that. Combined with that, my mother was a dance instructor. So I tend to think in terms, and language is also about thought. It's not just about language. I tend to think in terms of, or through the lens of art. And that deeply influences my way of seeing things. And indeed, one of the things that we see a lot in Wendell Mayo's article about creative writing and collaborative learning is this idea that most theories of writing are actually based on theories of art. But if we learn language through these acquisitional practices, which are inherently collaborative, you're learning them from the world, then there's a certain logical progression to think, okay, well, why would we stop that? Why would we impede that? And like we go into the classroom, okay, we've learned how language, we've learned how to read, we've learned all of this about how to communicate in the world. And then we go into a classroom and we're going to cut off all the collaboration and it's just going to be a teacher telling you what and how to write, which also inherently, if you think about it, results in a situation, if it's just one person teaching you how to write and what to write, because language embodies thought, it's almost inevitable that that person's going to teach you what to think. And that's where indoctrination comes. It's when we break down the collaborative process. So we really need collaboration in a classroom. Some other things that Mayo says that I think are useful to thinking about here is that language gives form to feeling. And in the process, it not only expresses emotion and ideas, it transforms emotion and ideas through a negotiation of the writer's felt sense of the world and the symbols that represent it. That transformational process from inner to outer, from private to public, is inherent in the creative writing act because of the assumption that there is an audience. So let me slow down a little bit. There's a lot of heavy lifting philosophically going on there, but it's really not that heavy or difficult to understand if you think about it. Just think about memory, for example, and what happens. So memory and I've got all sorts of theories about this because I've written a lot about memory, but actually we retain very little of an event, a couple of images. And then what happens is, or as time proceeds, we narrate the event to someone else. And in that process, the narration becomes the memory. So the storytelling aspect of memory is what cements in our brain, not the actual sensory input that we get. Um, the strange thing is those sensory inputs are absolutely essential to writing to in order to immerse a reader in the experience so that they can enjoy it and experience it with you. So part of the narrative process is also feeding back in sensory details that we might not have anymore. So inherently that process is transformative. It's not just transformative in the sense that we're revising it to make it better or more accurate. We're actually changing the memory, changing the experience as we try to express it to another person. So meaning not only is writing collaborative, meaning is a collaborative process. Whenever you're going to have an audience, and frankly, most language situations, there's an audience. Creative writing then is a process of inner voices being put back into the social world, right? Um, and then if you think about that, then writing is an exploration of identity, pause, in the world. In other words, we're not just expressing who we are, we're expressing who we are in the world to the world. So there's this inherently social act to writing. So why do we need to make the creative writing classroom collaborative? Well, if you think about this, hopefully, if I were asking this in a class, you'd parrot back at me. Well, you just said it's a social act. So we need to make creative writing a social act. And this is incredibly important because that's what we're about to do. Starting next week, we're going to be doing this small group work. Um, and the idea is that you're going to be collaborating in this process of meaning making. All right. So that's just something to be thinking about. Some thoughts on how this bears on the two teaching philosophies that we have for this week. So, um, in a sense, I'm trying to do two things here. I feel like my minister on Sunday was trying to teach both the gospel and the first and second readings for the day, and was trying to yank them together, and it wasn't his most successful sermon because they really didn't have too much to do with each other. These do, but I also want you to know that we're reading the teaching philosophy so you can learn how to create a teaching philosophy, right? And as I was reading this, I recognized that had some really intense ideological things going on. So that's why I began by talking about ideology. I'm not teaching you Carolyn Forché's teaching philosophy so that you will adapt all of her ideas, including the political ones. And it's the same thing with the Stendifor. I'm showing them to you so you can experience different teaching philosophies and actually think about what a teaching philosophy looks like. So when you have to write it, you've got some models for the form, not necessarily the ideas. But some things to think about from Carolyn Forché. I'd say Carolyn Forché is very much swimming in the waters that we would call collaborative learning. And a lot of this comes up because she begins this whole long section about her first experiences as a teacher. And she's really thrown into worlds that she's not really exactly comfortable in, and that she doesn't know very well, and she doesn't know how to navigate. And since she's learning to teach, as her students are learning to write, this is a true collaborative learning situation where it's not just the students who are learning, but the professor as well. So you have this long reflective section, which I would encourage you to do, maybe not as long or as involved as Forché's, but I very much encourage you to think about your own learning experience. You may not have a teaching experience yet, although some of you do, but you have a learning experience that you can reflect on that helps, and that those experiences are what develop your sense of the teacher you want to be, the learner you want to be, the good and bad experiences um, kind of form the teacher that you want to be. So you have this reflective section, and she focuses on the question of justice instead of the search for truth. Now, that makes sense because she's dealing with students from these backgrounds that are in an open access institution, where the students are coming into the classroom with very little preparation. They don't know standard English. Some of them are their reading skills are lagging. And so she's really having to meet them where they are. And you have to create an environment where the students are helping each other. She also has a situation which is a very collaborative experience where she walks in, realizes the students is self-segregated. I'm sure you've experienced this before. Human beings tend to do this. They tend to split off into groups of affinity groups of people that they feel comfortable with. And she says, well, I'm not going to teach to a segregated house. Kind of like the Beatles saying they wouldn't perform to a segregated audience when they performed in the South in the late 60s, mid to late 60s. She's saying, I won't do that. And then she's like, so I'm going to leave. You guys work it out. When I come back in, I don't want the class to be segregated anymore, which was interesting because she put the power in their hands. That might not necessarily have gone well. I don't know if I would ever uh, walk out of a classroom and let students work it out that way because things could get heated, things get bad, and I've abdicated my responsibility to protect the students somewhat. But I love the idea of putting the students in charge of their learning environment there. And I mean, that seems like a simple thing to do, but anytime you can feel comfortable putting students in a situation where they can take some possession of their learning experience, whether it is, okay, here's some readings we're going to do, which ones do you want to do? Or, if they have a bunch of readings, which ones do you want to talk about today? Or asking them, how do you want to go about this? Or allowing them to run their own workshops or come up with their own questions for workshop. Um, if you can get those things to happen, then you're actually giving them some power, but you're also reintroducing them to learning and writing as a collaborative process. She believes that the creative writing classroom should be an open space for critical thought. Again, that should be all backgrounds and all belief systems as long as we respect each other, right? Again, I don't see that as a progressive idea, realizing that there are people in the room of different experiences, different beliefs from you, different, um, you know, uh, ideas about gender or race than you do, and respecting that and actually being able to talk to people about that in a respectful way seems to me, the inherent, like democratic ideal, which we would like to have in a classroom. She talks about extensive individual conferences. Now, that can result in a very heavy authority and submissive student dynamic. We're going to talk more about that and how you can avoid that and how you can maintain a sense of student authority and power in that relationship. But we'll get to that when we can. I think from Forche's point of view, it helps her to tailor the student's specific creative writing needs. To the classroom and to tailor her teaching back to the student. So that is collaborative as long as you're paying attention to the student and not just spouting the same thing to every student. One learns to write by reading. That makes sense because if writing is a collaborative process, you're not just collaborating with the students in your classroom, the other students, you're collaborating with a larger literary world. Um, that also makes it really important that the teacher selects reading and text from various different communities and backgrounds. Um, Addressing process over product and allowing for conversations about content and purpose, not just craft. So you're in the classroom. Just focusing on craft can be a bit of a dodge, I think. For one thing, craft is loaded with assumptions that have come to us over time that are not always democratic, inclusive, or um, you know, well, democratic or inclusive, I guess would be the two words I get stuck on. But we'll have more discussion of that when we start talking about the Chavez book a little bit later on. Catherine E. Standifer, it's funny because in some ways she comes off as like a storm the barricades kind of ideology, but her teaching methodology is a bit more traditional. She says that writing is an act of power. Yeah, but she says my class is craft centric. Hmm. Okay, that's a very traditional idea of teaching, and I think craft is very important. But she does go on to say that she equates craft with thinking, that thinking is part of the craft, learning to reflection, learning essaying. We call that commentary in creative nonfiction. Um, but still, despite the politics of it, it feels like a fairly top-down approach to teaching, which is fine. But I just wanted to point out that sometimes a person's politics are not necessarily borne up in their teaching practices. Um, so you know, it's not as easy as saying, okay, well, this is this left-wing like lunatic, and therefore they're teaching me this way, and there's this right-wing conservative, and therefore they're teaching me the other. You know, I have enough experience in the creative writing classroom with my peers to know that some of the most oppressive teachers I've run into have been left-leaning, and some of the most democratic have been right-leaning. I don't really think it's an ideological divide. I think it's about how you perceive, how you think about the way you learn to write, and also how you think about how what your own experiences have taught you about your own learning practices. Usually, those are the things that we try to learn from and enact as teachers. Writing is about going into the world. Again, writing is a social act. And focusing on and she also talks about focusing on essays we refuse to write, which is again about getting this inner voice out into the social world. Um, Sometimes that involves giving someone permission and hoping that someone feels safe enough to explore material that might be very difficult or even frightening to encounter. Um, so these are the readings for this week, and I'm trying to give you a guide to how they connect and why you need to pay attention to them. Um, First of all, collaborative learning. I very intentionally gave you that this week since next week we start our small group writing workshops. Secondly, the statement of teaching philosophies, because that's the first major assignment we have coming up, is that statement to, or one of the major assignments we have coming up is the statement of teaching philosophy. And I want you to get some experience looking at what these might look like. We will have more about that soon, including a prompt that I'm going to have you finish up before you write that. So you should be well prepared for it. I know that the theory and the pedagogy and the thinking is starting to pile up, and maybe you're starting to feel a little overwhelmed by all of it. Just remember, we're taking this one little beat at a time. What are the things we've gone over so far? We've gone over the transactional writing classroom. We've talked about mutuality in the writing classroom, and now we're talking about collaboration in the writing classroom. All of these things make a lot of sense if you think about them, one at a time. We're also going to be, as we move forward, talking about, okay, how do we work a workshop with those kinds of ideas in mind? And then we're going to talk about, well, how do you do an individual student meeting with those kinds of ideas in mind? And also we're going to talk about where is the place for lecture in a classroom, especially in like we're in an online environment. I can imagine how you'd respond to the things I'm saying, but at the moment, um, it is a lot of me talking at you. But I will stop that right now. I'm really looking forward to getting you guys interacting with each other next week. I think that's when the class becomes kind of hot. It's not just kind of like I'm just kind of plodding away through my readings. Now we're actually putting them into practice. I'm excited about that. Remember that if you are writing, you are in you are up to present to your group in the first week. Um, Remember that that means you need a short piece of writing uh, for your readers to read. And I've gone through. I sent you guys an email. I'm going to send you another email reminder to make sure that you remember what you're responsible for and what you need to do. I'm going to stop there. More soon. I hope you're all doing well. Hang in there.